Hi guys, back here again, this time to talk about intermediate level play and how a inverted long pip or a short pip, long pip or anti-spin player, how to win at the intermediate level. So we're really going to be focusing on moving on from the beginner stuff and starting to focus on that mid-range, I guess, of table tennis and how to win against people who aren't just going to make mistakes and give you the point, basically. So to start with, I'll do a similar format to what we did in the beginning videos. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what characteristics you'll find in intermediate level play. So what the type of games are characterised by, what sort of errors or good shots you'll see. Then we'll talk a little bit more about actually how to, what you should be starting to think about and starting to do in order to win at this level. Now the overall guiding rule and guiding characteristic, I think, at intermediate level is what I would call a rule of three. The rule of three is what I usually was telling a lot of my students who are at this sort of level. Remember back at the beginning I said beginning level play characterised by mistakes or unforced mistakes. Well, at the intermediate level I think the rule of three is sort of generally what I would call the defining characteristic of intermediate level play. What the basic rule of three is, the way I define it, is that when attacking, when you're on the offensive, you should be able to put 3 good solid attacks on the table. And that's assuming, say, your opponent does a good block or maybe a good chop or whatever, but you should be able to, 70 to 80% of the time, land 3 attacks in a row. And if you can do that 70-80% of the time, you're going to win most of the points. Because at this intermediate level, it's not common for your opponent to be able to make 3 or more returns against an intermediate level attack that you will have. So 3 in a row, 3 attacks in a row are what you're looking to be able to do. Okay? So part of your training is gearing yourself to be able to loop, have the opponent block, loop another block, loop a third. And if you can't do that, it's not that you can't win at intermediate level, but you're going to struggle to attack and beat other intermediate players with attack, your attack side of the game at intermediate level. However, if you can, what you'll find is generally you'll be able to dominate any aggressive rallies simply because your opponent maybe will block 1, sometimes will block 2, but usually by the 3rd he's gone. You'll have won the point. Okay, so that's on the offensive side. The rule of 3 is to be able to land 3 good attacks on in a row, staying balanced, all not at 100%, but sort of at that 80 to 90% where you're balanced and hitting a good ball, 3 in a row. On defense, when someone is attacking you, same rule of 3. The rule of 3 is to get 3 balls decently back, whether it's 3 decent blocks or 3 chops if you're a far from the table chopper. If you can put the ball back when someone's attacking you, if you can put it back 3 times off his attack, that means he's going to have to go to a 4th attack, and that means usually you're going to win, because very few intermediates are good enough to go to that 4th attack. And to be honest, quite a lot of intermediates aren't even good enough to go to the 3rd. So these are my rules of thumb that I was basically telling a lot of my students, and that was, okay, on aggression, I want you to be able to do 3 in a row. And when you train towards doing 3 in a row. And if you're in training and you're hitting one big one to your partner and he can't get it back, so in effect you're only training 1 or 2 in a row, it's not going to help you as much as if you slow down and make sure that you're doing 3 to 4. Okay? On defense, your job is to 3 decent blocks, 3 decent chops. Okay? And if you can do that, you're going to win a lot of the points. I'll get into that a little bit more later, and I mean, it's fairly self-evident why that's important, but I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the how to win stage a bit. But that's really what I would call the defining characteristic, is the rule of three. The intermediates who can do 3 attacks, 3 blocks are very quickly going to move up into the advanced levels. The ones who can't are going to tend to struggle and stay around intermediate status for a long, long time. Okay, so having said that, what are some other characteristics of intermediate level play? What differs it from the beginners or the advanced? What you'll usually find at this sort of level, first thing I'll mention, and these are in no particular order, but they're just points that you'll find, is at intermediate level play, almost all intermediate players have 1 or 2 weapons that they can rely on. Whether it's a good forehand loop attack, perhaps off top spin, whether it's a very heavy backhand push, whether it's a great serve. You know, they'll have something, 1 or 2 things at least usually. Something in their arsenal that they can rely on is going to mean that if they get that shot, they're going to win the point a lot of the time. So they've got 1 or 2 real weapons. Okay. Obviously the more the better, but you usually don't get to I'm about to tell you a lie, but I was going to say you usually don't get to intermediate level play without having a weapon. It's possible if you don't take any risks and just play a very safe game, you can get to intermediate level play, but in that case what you're doing is your weapon is basically the fact that you're not making mistakes, and even that will only go so far. So yeah, 1 or 2 weapons. Now on the flip side, usually most intermediate players are going to have 1 or 2 really awful gaps in their game, and by that I mean just something where they're terribly bad. So it kind of balances out. They've got a couple of things that they do quite well, but there's usually a couple of things that they really stink at. And that's kind of natural, that there's just some things at an intermediate level where you've probably been playing for anywhere from a year, 2 years, or possibly more, depending on how long you've been playing. But you usually just haven't had enough table tennis and enough training to cover everything. So there's going to be a couple of areas where you just suck at. You just haven't done enough table work or enough training. So that's normal as well. At intermediate level, there's also, for the average person who's never been coached, at intermediate level is probably the area at the time at which, after about a year or so, you start to come to that idea and the realisation that tactics actually do make a big difference. And the reason for this is now at this level, what's happening is when you're playing other people of around your level, what you're finding is you've got some good points, you've got some bad points, and you've got some average things. Your opponent usually has some good things and some bad things and some average things. And what will happen is you'll find there'll be some people that you'll play who suit you and you'll beat them. There are other people who don't seem to be any better level but will beat you. And it's because of these strengths and weaknesses matching up. And it's usually about this point that you'll start to be thinking, well, why can I beat him, but I can't beat him? But this guy who I beat, why can he beat him? And it's, some people say, well, it's just a style thing. And it is a little bit, but it's also usually, it's starting to be that first awakening of, hey, maybe tactically my style suits this guy better, but I could change things and copy what he does a little bit, and maybe I do better against this guy. And people try it, and sometimes it works a bit, and you start to get that first idea of, hey, tactics can be good. So, unfortunately, then it comes down to you're still quite often at this level not quite sure what are the best tactics for your game and for a particular opponent. So there's probably a better way to do things, but you don't always know exactly what that is or how to work it out. And but you're on the road. Let's say you're on the road of working out that, hey, maybe I can do things better and have better results against certain players who I struggle with if I take a different approach. So tactics is starting to get there. Sometimes also at this level, this is the kind of level where at intermediate level, playing for fun and just enjoying the game, although you still enjoy it, this is a level where you start to really, the pressure and the nerves start to kick in as you kind of hate to start losing to people who are lower or around your level. And I think it's because, by this stage you've invested a bit of time and a bit of effort in the game. You know you like it. If you're a normal person who has normal kind of desires, you probably get a bit of a kick out of beating other people. There's that desire to get better. And so when you go out against someone around your level or a little bit lower, there's just that little feeling of, I think I can win, I think I should win, I'll be embarrassed if I don't win maybe against the lower guys. And it's the first kind of appearance of real pressure where you've got a little bit of something to lose in terms of your own ego, your own reputation in your own head. And it's the first time that sort of nerves and choking can start to come into your game at this sort of level, generally speaking. Another thing that's happening is in terms of serve and return of serve. This is the level where you start to get an appreciation that perhaps long serves isn't always the way to go. You notice when you play a better player, they quite often lock you up and they beat you with their serving and short serve you off the table and spin you off the table with it and basically take away your chances to attack. Not only when they serve, but also when they return serve. You're serving and they're controlling the game for the return of serve and you never get a chance to really attack much. And what's happening is they're basically outclassing you with serve and return of serve and taking away your chances to attack. So this is a level at which you start to appreciate that serving short to stop your opponent attacking can be a good thing. Because this is now the level where if you serve long and loose, some of your intermediate level opponents have got a good enough attack to punish you and you'll start to get hurt on that and you start to appreciate a short serve can be good. It's also the level at which now some of these opponents also have some pretty nasty serves. Not necessarily lots of them, but you'll find that a few opponents will have one or two really tough serves and they'll win a lot of points off you unless you adjust very fast. So it's also the level now at which return of serve starts to really become important, and the ability to not only adjust when someone's beating you with a serve and start to get it back, but it's also the level where what you do with the return of serve starts to become really important. Because at beginner level, putting it back and giving your opponent lots of chances to make mistakes was enough. At intermediate level, putting it back in the middle of the table is your last resort, and now we have to start looking at where to put it. And we'll probably talk about that more in other videos, I think, but it's just something to be aware of at intermediate level. Stroke selection. Yep. This is the level in intermediate level play. I think you'll find that sometimes you fall in love with a particular stroke that you play well, and you try to play it every time on every stroke, regardless of whether that's the appropriate stroke. Typical cases is usually that forehand loop, especially the strong power loop that's very fast, very spinny. Once you get a bit of a taste for that and you get a bit of success, it goes to your head a little bit sometimes, and you then try and power loop anything and everything. It doesn't matter whether the ball's low, heavily chopped, high, wide, to your backhand, you're still running around trying to hit this big forehand power loop. And what happens is, it's a good stroke under certain circumstances, but you're trying to make the stroke do more than it really can, and you're trying to make yourself do more than you can. So what's happening is, at beginner level, sometimes you'll realise, hey, I do this, here I hit this one, here I hit that one, and I can't always, I'll do what's appropriate, what I'm limited to. And then suddenly you've got a weapon, that can win a point, and now it's like, oh, I've got to play it there, everywhere. And that's not quite the attitude. It's almost right, but not quite. The attitude is actually, I want to play it whenever I can, and I'll play it whenever it's in that rough area for me to play it, but if not, then I will play something else. So you should be looking to use the weapon, but if the ball's not there for you to use it, you've got to be able to say, no, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to do what's appropriate at the time, rather than just every shot playing your big shot all the time, because you'll just lose more points. So stroke selection now becomes important to use the big shots when appropriate. Footwork. Yep. Footwork, at intermediate level, we're starting to get now the first idea that perhaps if we move and stay balanced, we can hit more than one big shot in a row. And it starts to become important because usually with the big forehand that people develop first, that requires good balance and good stance to hit and stay balanced. And at beginner level, it didn't really, because everyone's pitter-pattying and kind of not hitting that hard that often. And if you hit a good one, it quite often didn't come back. Now the ball starts to come back a little bit. So if your footwork is poor and your stance is poor and you're throwing yourself off balance, you will often hit that big forehand, big shot, throw yourself off balance. Your opponent just puts the ball back, not even necessarily well, but just puts it back on the table, and you're so off balance you still can't get back. Or he just puts it to the other side of the table, and you're so off balance you can't move. And that's the idea at this point where people start to think, hey, look, I need some footwork, and I need to be balanced in terms of my technique, and then maybe I can hit 2 in a row, and I can hit 3 in a row. And that starts to mesh together with this idea of the rule of 3. Is in order to hit 3 in a row, you have to be balanced, you have to have good stance, you have to have good fundamental technique on the forehand so that you finish balanced rather than finish over here off balance. And it all melds together to allow you to go to the next level, moving up to high, intermediate and advanced. But footwork starts to really become a factor at intermediate level. It starts to become important because it's what allows you to chain and put several attacks together, several defensive shots together as well. So footwork comes into it now. Okay, bad habits, yeah. Usually by intermediate level play, you've been playing 1 or 2 years, maybe a little bit faster, a little bit longer. But by this stage, you've been playing a little bit of table tennis, and that's usually enough time to develop a couple of really nasty bad habits. It could be you've developed a poor grip. It could be you developed a quirk in your forehand where you lift the elbow. It could be that you play all your backhands close to the table in a really backhand stance and it hurts your forehand. It could be anything, but usually what you'll find is because probably 90%, 95% of players don't get a lot of coaching to start with, by the time they've played 1 or 2 years, they've played a lot, they've worked out a lot by themselves, and they've developed just a few things that just are basically hurting their game, just some really bad habits. Yeah, so that's also a characteristic. Equipment. Yeah, I would say at intermediate level, not always at the first year or second year, but a little bit, but quite often those guys who have been at intermediate level for 2 years, for 3 years, for 4 years, for 5 years, these are the guys who are what we call the equipment junkies, who basically have to get another fix of new equipment and are always looking for the next big weapon. You know, if I get this rubber, maybe that will fix my game. If I get that blade, maybe that will fix my game. You've got to get off that treadmill of constantly searching for new rubber. Now, no rubber is going to fix up your game. Good technique and training will fix up your game. Intelligent use of tactics will help fix up your game. You know, but the rubber itself, you know, out of the whole player thing, the equipment, the basic equipment, while itself is important, you know, like we're using a combination bat, so that makes up a big amount of our game, inverted and long pips or short pips or whatever. And there's no doubt that equipment is important to us, but the type of inverted, as long as it's kind of thinnish rubber with decent grip and not too sticky and not too fast, whether it's tackiness chop or domination or tango defence or any of, as long as it's a reasonable chopping rubber, it's not going to make much difference. As long as your long pips, have thin sponge or no sponge and have a little bit of flexibility and a little bit of grip, it's not going to make a lot of difference, that kind of thing. Certainly not as much as sort of getting out and training for 5 hours would make. So, although it's fun to talk about equipment, I don't mind talking about equipment. I like that as much as the next guy. Don't fool yourself that it's more important than actually doing the training technique. So have fun talking about it by all means, but during the season, don't be changing rubbers. Save that for a month or two in your off season, then pick a rubber, stick with it, train with it, and only if things are going horribly wrong, try looking for another rubber. And just in the meantime, the rest of the time, train and play with your rubber that you've got. Twiddling, twiddling. At this level, twiddling is usually the technique is kind of mastered. You know how to twiddle. You don't get caught too often or get stuck in the middle of a twiddle. That's usually okay. You'll end up when you twiddle in reasonable position to get a shot. So we've mastered the technique. What's moving on an intermediate level play is more about when to twiddle. And you're still, at this level, you're still kind of really deciding on your game. It's still flexible, so your game is still evolving as you go. And the twiddling, you just have to be aware of as your game goes in a certain direction, you have to twiddle what's appropriate to that direction as well. And be careful not to over twiddle and that kind of thing. So twiddling's, this is the level now where when to twiddle, why to twiddle, is starting to become more important than just actually the technique of twiddling. So, and training, that's the last little one here. Usually, in terms of training now, not all of us have a lot of time to train, and that's fine. You may only have an hour or two a week. Training is good, but usually for training, what you'll find is 90% of people, when they do some training at this intermediate level, they're training the wrong things and really working on stuff that's not appropriate or they don't need. And you have to have a good hard look at your game. And I'll again talk about this really more in another video. It's something to be expanded on later. But what I'm saying basically in a nutshell when we talk about training is, firstly, don't train stuff that you're not going to need in a match. Okay? So if you're a close to the table blocker, don't train counter looping 3 metres back. Pointless, you're never going to use it. Don't train chopping from 3 metres back. You're not going to use it. If you're a close to the table player, train your close to the table stuff. Stick to that, you'll get much more benefit. And then during the match, don't back up. Stay close and use what you've got there. But there's no point training off table stuff if you're a close to the table player. The other thing then in training is usually you've got to work some on your strengths because you've got to make sure that they're sharp and they're good and they're winning your points. You've got to work a little bit on your weaknesses, your worst holes. But again, I'll come to that in a second. But basically, you've got to be working on the stuff that's going to benefit you the very most at this level. You haven't got time for wasting time. So we've got to work on productive things. But I'll come to that a little bit later. Okay, and those are kind of, I think, there are probably others, but those are a lot of the characteristics that you find at intermediate level play. Probably the last thing I'd probably say at intermediate level play is you'll also find a lot of inconsistency in terms of not only of your game, in terms of that you'll hit some and miss some, but just on the day. At intermediate level, there will be days where you'll turn up and you'll play great. And there'll be days that you'll turn up and you'll play lousy. And there'll be some days where in one game you'll play great and in the next game you'll play lousy. And you kind of hit and miss. And that's another characteristic just of this intermediate level where things aren't grooved. You're still learning, there's some things you do well, your mental focus is possibly, and concentration, is possibly not all that it could be yet. And so you tend to be patchy. whereas more advanced players have less problems. Not no problems, but they have less problems in that regard.